This is what happens when a facade is not designed for user comfort, and in particular for user interaction and user multi-domain comfort, which is the topic of this lecture. Users in buildings are exposed to different environmental domains. Thermal, in relation to the thermal environment, the temperatures, the airflows around our body. Visual environment, in relation to the brightness that is surrounding a user, the level of the light, but also the access to outdoor view. The acoustic environment, in relation to the sound environment, which sometimes is uncomfortable if there are unpleasant noise. And for instance, also the air quality, which is also the olfactory domain, which also takes an important role, not only in satisfaction in relation to smells, but also in health and therefore human well-being. All these domains are not acting separately. Users in buildings are simultaneously exposed to each of these domains. Therefore, it's very important to understand as well how these domains interact to each other and affect user response. How do people respond to different environmental conditions? So, well, firstly, we receive inputs, environmental stimuli, through our senses. And we have 5 senses, and this is quite important. But secondly, a physiological stimuli will also be linked immediately to a psychological response. We are going to have a different perception. We might be satisfied, dissatisfied, we might feel comfortable, uncomfortable, and so on. Now, physiology and psychology are not the only type of responses we have. We also have then a response that can be behavioral. We can move, position, we can act, we can try to intervene in the environment around us and change the conditions to restore our comfort. Understanding the perception, the physiological response, and the behavior of people in buildings are key elements to understand and evaluate if our design is successful from a user-centered perspective. Now we're going to have a better look at what do we mean with user multi-domain comfort and facade design, but also user interaction and personal control with facades. Let's move closer to a user and a facade. People in buildings are surrounded by many things. Some are related to the facade, but others are not. For instance, the type of furniture and the colors, the textures, but also the HVAC, the artificial services, like also artificial lights. All of these factors will affect comfort. So we need to be careful that when we assess the impact of facades on comfort, we also consider the context where this facade is installed. And this also includes the outdoor environment, the time of the day, the position of the sun, the orientation, and in the general outdoor climate. Because, of course, facades are passive components, usually, and they filter, they are a barrier, they can, let's say, mitigate and improve the outdoor condition impact to indoor, but they are usually a passive component. So when we look at a user close to a facade, depending on the distance, the facade will have a different effect. And it's also important to consider not just the distance, but the orientation towards the facade. There are many parameters on a facade that we have to select. We usually do this selection because of energy, but also because of comfort. I'll give you a couple of examples. The thermal resistance or U value are not only dictating the overall heat transfer, but also what is going to be the surface temperature. And the surface temperature of a facade is going to affect, depending on the distance and the view factor, the thermal comfort of the user. Another example related to visual. So for sure we know that the level of transparency and the potential to shade a facade, so the G value, in other words, it's very important to restore thermal and visual comfort. But other parameters is, for instance, the clarity of the view through a facade and the content you can access through a facade. And this is related to the very important factor of allowing access to outdoor view, which is very much appreciated by users, especially when sitting close to a facade. So what happens when the design choices that we're doing on the facade design are not affecting all the comfort domain positively, but we are actually creating some competing factors? I will give you now some examples of contrasting factors in facade design. For instance, we might decide to go for a very transparent facade with a large window-to-wall ratio. This enable us to have access to daylight and to view, even if, for instance, it might mean to have a view to a container, which is not the best. However, of course, there may be other issues. For instance, privacy is a big issue, and therefore we might decide to lower the blinds to restore our comfort and avoid intrusive presences. But also, this is a typical example of when we lower the shades because we want to minimize solar gains and maintain thermal comfort, or protect people from excessive brightness and glare. But of course, as soon as we lower the blinds, we miss and we lose any contact to daylight and outdoor view. And last but not least, moving blinds sometimes can cause very disruptive noises. Or for instance, we might want to open a door or a window to allow a larger rate of fresh air for indoor air quality or thermal comfort. But this of course means to expose user to outdoor noise, which sometimes may be dissatisfactory for the user, but also, for instance, uncomfortable drafts. As you can see, multi-domain comfort and satisfaction is a complex topic, which sometimes even requires research to understand how facades or other building components are impacting the behavior, the physiological and psychological response of user in a multi-domain manner. And this is why we need also to conduct research in specialized laboratories, like this one, the MATE Lab, which is a dedicated lab at TU Delft for studying human comfort and interaction in a multi-domain manner, and in particular in relation to facade components. I will now introduce you to two researchers working here on these topics. Come with me. We are now here with our colleague Pablo Martinez Alcaraz, who is doing research at TU Delft on multi-domain comfort requirements and controls. And you might recognize his face actually because he was helping us in our lecture before. Thank you, Pablo. So we're here now to ask you some questions on your research. So we saw that designing a facade has to take into account the multi-domain interaction for comfort and user satisfaction. My question to you is if this is also important in designing a control strategy of a facade technology.
Of course, it is important since the fact that we have building services integrated in the facade that are dynamic, therefore can be operated. For this, sometimes we use automation, and we want, of course, the automation to take the best decisions in the space. And some of the decisions kind of like trade off with all those multi-domain factors that needs to be understood in the space from the human perspective and from the group dynamic perspective that we might have in an office space, for example.
This is very interesting. And would you say that the user interaction with the controls is also useful for the control strategy to learn over time?
Yes. As I said before, that we want this alignment with automation. One of the proxies that we use is occupant behavior with those interfaces, switches, displays, window like actuator. With these interactions, we are able to capture data from occupants and develop machine learning models that can understand those requirements, those multi-domain requirements that can inform building controls. So the design or of those interaction strategies are very important for us.
And this also opens a very nice final chapter, which is how do we design for personal control and interaction when automation is controlling a facade. I'm gonna now have a chat with Pedro de la Barra, our colleague working on this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
I will go now, thanks. Hi, Pedro. Thank you for having us. Today we are learning about multi-domain user requirements, where user interaction and personal control take a very big role. So why it's important to have personal control with a facade?
Personal control in a facade is important because facades is one of the main means of adaptation within the building, meaning that by controlling the facade personally, we can fine-tune our indoor environment, thermal environment, visual environment, indoor air quality, or even acoustic environment.
And now that, let's say, automation is entering the space and is controlling also facade, is this changing the way we design
Yes, it's changing because now we need, even though we have a lot of automation, we need also more personal control or means to access to the control. Why? It's because automation can trigger a behavior in a negative way. So if we don't have personal control, we might misunderstood the automation. So personal control is also a way to balance what we receive from the building as automation and how we can basically have autonomy on how we set our environment.
And for instance, what are type of interaction that may happen in the space now that there is automation?
Yeah, there are different types of interactions. One is the most obvious one in which we interact with the building directly, right? We have personal control. Another type of interaction is the information we receive from buildings, like for instance, the status of the system or different other environmental parameters that can also help us to behave in a particular way.
Is this an example?
Yeah, this is an example of an interaction. In this case, we don't have a way to control the building, but we have information coming from the building.
Do we also give information to buildings?
We can also. One way to give information is, for instance, when we need to set up the blinds in a particular position, we tell the building what we want and the building would proceed with such an action.
And what about wearables and sensing occupants? Is this also creating an interaction?
Yeah, it's also a way of interaction because basically the wearable can sense physiological information from us, take information from the user and integrate that information into the control system, meaning that then the interaction also inform automation to behave in the way we need.
So we said information from the user to the building and from the building to the user, personal control of the user towards the building controls, but also automated sensing of users in buildings, and all type of interaction has to be designed for satisfactory buildings and facades. But then I'm wondering, could you list 3 parameters that designers can take into account when looking at a new facade component?
Yeah, in particular, when it comes to interaction strategies, there are 3 main parameters that we should take into account: the type of device we are using, the location within the building, and also the level of information. So the type of device will define how easy it is to operate the system, to then interact with the building. The type of the level of information will also enable the possibility for users to get the information they need, no more than that, no less than that, meaning that also they will understand the system. And the location, which is more about how intuitive is the interaction strategy within the space.
So where is it with respect to a desk or the entrance and so on? Exactly. And for instance, could you tell us something about this interface you design within the Smart History project?
Yeah, this is one of the efforts we made to prepare an interface that combines these 3 main aspects. So what we have here is a digital interface in which we have all of the components of this building, of this space, in a general layout. So basically, when you touch one of them, you can understand the status of this particular system, but also how you want to set up that building system. We have 2 main systems here: lights and also shadings. By pressing each of these icons, you can access to each of them and interact freely with the building.
And did you see a difference in user requirements in terms of what to show in this interface, or what type of interface, like the buttons you are holding in your hand with respect to a digital interface?
Yeah, there is a difference, for instance, in terms of the office setup. If we talk about shared offices, some people can prefer having analog interfaces like this one, in which they just go for a very simple way of interacting with the building by pressing these 2, but not much information. Users are prone to select this type of interfaces, which are located mostly next to the entrance, and they are more intuitive, more simple, without information. And that's because they prefer to have something that everyone understands. When it comes to personal control and on-desk controls for managing your closest environment, they prefer to have more information and also a bit more complex interfaces to fine-tune better their environment, more options, let's say.
So, for instance, being in a shared office space or on an individual space may impact user preferences, but on an individual level, could we say that everyone wants to have the same relationship and interaction strategy with automation and automated facades?
No, everyone has their own expectations, their own requirements. There are some people that are prone to prefer more simpler interfaces or way to interact without too many information. But also in terms of automation, there are some users that prefer have manual control instead of fully automated systems. And also we have the opposite. Some ones that really like to have automation because they feel that they don't need to care about the environment. So that's an important aspect actually you are mentioning, because if we understand that, we can design better the interaction strategies we place in buildings.
Thank you very much. I think now we have all the information we need to design a user-centered facade strategy of control. Thank you.